Ever been in a meeting where everyone seems to agree, and it feels like you've stepped into a bizarre mind control experiment? You're waiting for someone to say, "Wait a second, is this really a good idea?" But instead, you get a room full of nodding heads, like everyone's auditioning to be a bobblehead. Well, congratulations, you've just entered the world of groupthink. And if history tells us anything, when everyone agrees, bad things happen. Groupthink is that sneaky little phenomenon where everyone in a group decides it's safer to just go along than to speak up. It's not about everyone genuinely agreeing, it's about everyone being too scared, too loyal, or too comfortable to disagree. The result? Terrible decisions that everyone should have seen coming. For example, in 1986, when NASA made the fateful decision to launch the Space Shuttle Challenger despite repeated warnings from their own engineers about the potential failure of the O-rings. You see, those O-rings were small rubber seals that kept hot gases from escaping the rocket boosters. And while these rings worked fine in warm conditions, they had a troubling track record of becoming brittle in cold weather. The night before the launch, temperatures had dropped below freezing, and engineers at Morton Thiokol, the contractor responsible for the shuttle's solid rocket boosters, practically begged NASA to postpone. They were on the phone, laying out data and raising red flags, but senior management at both Morton Thiokol and NASA were already locked into the excitement and public pressure of the launch. So what happened? A perfect storm of overconfidence, institutional pressure, and an almost ritualistic desire to stay on schedule. Morton Thiokol's executives, faced with pressure from NASA, dismissed the engineers' concerns and told their teams to take off their engineering hats and think like managers. The result was a catastrophic case of groupthink. Instead of pausing and listening to their experts, NASA's management rationalized the risks away and convinced themselves, and everyone else, that everything was fine. They didn't want to be the ones who delayed a highly publicized launch, especially one with the first civilian, a schoolteacher, on board. It wasn't fine. 73 seconds after liftoff, Challenger disintegrated in midair, killing all 7 crew members on board. The explosion wasn't just a tragedy, it was a preventable disaster, a brutal lesson in what happens when groupthink and pressure trump science and common sense. Or take the decision to invade Iraq in 2003. In the lead up to the invasion, a small circle of high-ranking US government officials and intelligence leaders were locked into a singular narrative, that Saddam Hussein's regime possessed weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and posed an imminent threat. The pressure to act was building, and the White House was eager to present a united front. Dissenting opinions from experienced intelligence analysts and diplomats were quietly brushed aside or outright dismissed. Instead of encouraging debate, the administration reinforced the echo chamber by cherry-picking intelligence that confirmed their beliefs. It wasn't just a case of wishful thinking, it was a masterclass in groupthink, fueled by loyalty, pressure, and a fixation on a particular outcome. Intelligence reports that contradicted the WMD theory were marginalized, and those who questioned the prevailing narrative were quickly branded as unpatriotic or not supporting the troops. In this highly charged atmosphere, going against the grain wasn't just uncomfortable, it was career suicide. One notable example was when a CIA team reported serious doubts about the presence of WMDs in Iraq. Their assessments were downplayed, while reports from less credible sources, like the infamous and now discredited claims from an Iraqi informant codenamed Curveball, were elevated and treated as concrete evidence. Curveball's information was sketchy at best, but it fit the narrative, so it was accepted without critical scrutiny. The decision-making process became more about reinforcing group cohesion and protecting the administration's credibility than about evaluating the facts. Leaders who voiced caution, like Secretary of State Colin Powell and some members of the intelligence community, were undercut by more influential voices in the room. And when the invasion was finally greenlit, the group consensus prevailed over any lingering doubts. The result? A war based on faulty intelligence and assumptions that left the US and its allies embroiled in years of costly chaos and conflict. The invasion not only destabilized Iraq, leading to a power vacuum that contributed to the rise of extremist groups like ISIS, but it also shattered public trust in government intelligence and decision-making. The cost? Thousands of lives lost, billions of dollars spent, and geopolitical instability that's still being felt to this day. It was a stark reminder that when everyone nods in agreement without question, the consequences can echo for generations. Or how about the 2008 financial crisis? This wasn't just a hiccup, it was a global economic meltdown triggered by a dangerous cocktail of greed, blind optimism, and, of course, groupthink. In the years leading up to the crash, banks, rating agencies, and investors were all patting each other on the back, convinced that subprime loans were like golden tickets to endless profits. The idea was simple: hand out risky loans to just about anyone, bundle them up into mortgage-backed securities, slap a AAA rating on them, and watch the money roll in. It was too good to fail, or so they thought. The problem? Nobody wanted to be the voice of reason. When Wall Street's top dogs, Rating agencies and government regulators started getting cozy. They created an echo chamber of unbridled enthusiasm and self-reinforcing delusion. Executives at big financial firms kept pushing subprime mortgages because everyone else was doing it, and nobody wanted to be left behind. Homebuyers with no credit history or stable income were getting approved for loans they had no realistic chance of repaying. But instead of questioning whether selling a mansion to someone without a paycheck was, maybe, a terrible idea, the financial world doubled down. After all, everyone else was making a killing, why not join in? And it wasn't just the banks. Rating agencies like Moody's and Standard & Poor's, who were supposed to be the impartial referees of the financial game, got swept up in the hype too. They started slapping those risky mortgage-backed securities with top-notch ratings, despite glaring evidence that many of them were toxic junk. Why? Because the banks paid them to do it, and business was booming. They weren't incentivized to burst the bubble, they were incentivized to keep it inflating. Meanwhile, anyone who dared to question the system got laughed out of the room or ignored. Some analysts and insiders raised red flags, like financial analyst Michael Burry and hedge fund manager Steve Eisman, who dug into the data and discovered that these subprime mortgages were a ticking time bomb. But mainstream financial institutions brushed off their concerns as paranoia. Groupthink was so pervasive that those who spoke up were labeled as alarmists or not getting with the program. After all, when you're making billions, why would you stop to question the magic? And then, the house of cards came crashing down. When homeowners inevitably defaulted on their loans, the entire financial system collapsed like a Jenga tower built on sand. What followed was the worst global recession since the Great Depression. Banks failed, millions of people lost their homes, and countless others saw their savings evaporate. The bailout package alone cost US taxpayers over $700 billion, and the ripple effects were felt worldwide. Governments were left scrambling to contain the fallout, and faith in financial institutions was shattered. The 2008 financial crisis was a painful reminder that when everyone in the room is nodding and patting each other on the back, it's often because nobody's brave enough to say, wait a minute, is this a good idea? When groupthink takes over, the consequences aren't just bad decisions, they're economic catastrophes that take years to recover from and leave lasting scars on millions of lives. So, how do you spot groupthink before it torpedoes your next project or sends the world into a tailspin? Here are some signs to look out for. 1. Illusion of invulnerability. When the group starts believing it's invincible and ignoring the risks. It's like standing on the deck of the Titanic, bragging about how unsinkable your ship is, while icebergs are practically begging for attention. 2. Collective rationalization. When the group finds ways to rationalize every flaw. If the team's motto is "it'll be fine," while waving away obvious red flags, you're deep in groupthink territory. 3. Pressure to conform. If disagreeing feels like committing a social faux pas, or like you're about to get uninvited from happy hour, that's a sign something's wrong. 4. Self-censorship. This is when people censor their own thoughts instead of speaking up. If the most outspoken person in the office suddenly has nothing to say, take a hint. 5. The illusion of unanimity. When silence is taken as consent. Nobody objects, so everyone assumes the room is in agreement. Reality check: silence isn't always golden, sometimes it's just awkward. So, why does groupthink happen? Sometimes, it's just about not wanting to be that person who disagrees. You're at dinner with friends, and someone suggests the mystery seafood special. You're all too polite to say, "Are we sure we won't end up in the ER?" So, you nod along and hope for the best. Other times, it's about pressure. You're in a high-stakes meeting, and the boss is staring at you like they're waiting for an excuse to fire someone. So you play along and pretend everything's fine, even though your gut is screaming, "Abort mission." And then there's loyalty. You're so committed to the group that you start ignoring reality to stay in line. Think of political parties that rally around flawed leaders, or die-hard sports fans who insist their team is the best, even when they haven't won a game in a decade. When everyone's nodding in sync, bad things happen. Take the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. It started with a room full of some of the brightest minds in American politics, military, and intelligence, but despite their credentials, they fell into one of the most notorious groupthink traps in modern history. The plan was to invade Cuba with a CIA-backed force of Cuban exiles and trigger an uprising that would topple Fidel Castro's government. Sounds bold, right? But here's the kicker: the plan was, at best, half-baked and at worst, a recipe for disaster. President Kennedy's advisors were under immense pressure to present a tough stance against communism, and Cuba was seen as a dangerous Soviet outpost in America's backyard. Kennedy's newly appointed team of advisors, many of whom were eager to prove themselves, felt pressure to support the president's determination to take action against Castro. But instead of considering all the risks and dissenting voices, the group was caught in a collective echo chamber, where everyone convinced each other that the operation was not just viable but destined for success. Several military leaders and intelligence officers privately had serious doubts about the operation. They worried that the plan underestimated Castro's military strength and overestimated the likelihood of a popular uprising against his regime. However, instead of speaking up, they held back their reservations, afraid of appearing unpatriotic or soft on communism. Nobody wanted to be the one to say, hey, maybe launching a surprise invasion on a communist nation 90 miles from Florida isn't the brightest idea. Critical thinking and debate took a backseat to maintaining group cohesion and not rocking the boat. The planners ignored or rationalized away clear warning signs, like the lack of local support in Cuba and Castro's firm grip on power. A CIA report warning that the invasion force wasn't large or strong enough to stand a chance was conveniently brushed aside. As long as the president seemed confident, everyone else just nodded along, reinforcing each other's sense of invincibility. In the end, the invasion was a complete fiasco. The 1,400 CIA-trained Cuban exiles who landed at the Bay of Pigs found themselves facing an overwhelming Cuban military force. The planned uprising didn't materialize, the air support Kennedy had hinted at never came, and within days, nearly all the invaders were killed or captured. Castro's forces paraded the captured exiles on television, turning what was supposed to be a swift and decisive operation into a humiliating international spectacle. The fallout was swift and brutal. Kennedy's credibility took a major hit, Cuba's ties to the Soviet Union deepened, and the Cold War tensions escalated to new heights, setting the stage for the Cuban Missile Crisis a year later. The Bay of Pigs invasion showed what happens when groupthink replaces critical thinking. Everyone was so eager to support Kennedy, so eager to stay in the good graces of the administration, that they essentially put their common sense on airplane mode. It wasn't just a botched military operation, it was a case study in how a room full of smart people can make disastrously dumb decisions when nobody's willing to speak up and challenge the consensus. Or let's talk about Enron. The company that went from being America's most innovative corporation to the biggest corporate scandal in history. At its peak, Enron was the darling of Wall Street, an energy giant hailed for its revolutionary business strategies and sky-high stock prices. The executives, people like CEO Jeffrey Skilling and Chairman Ken Lay, built a culture of relentless ambition and almost religious devotion to thinking outside the box. But what was really happening inside the box? Fraud, manipulation, and, most importantly, a culture of groupthink that let the whole scheme go unchallenged. Enron's executives hyped up their brilliant financial strategies, like mark-to-market accounting, which allowed them to book hypothetical future profits as actual earnings. This made their financial statements look amazing, even when real cash flow was bleeding. They built a maze of complex accounting tricks and shadowy off-the-books partnerships called special purpose entities, SPEs, designed to hide debts and inflate profits. But here's the kicker, everybody on the inside knew these financial strategies were sketchy at best and criminal at worst. Yet, no one wanted to speak up and be the killjoy who questioned the so-called magic money machine. Why? Because the pressure to conform at Enron was massive. If you didn't go along with the hype, you were labeled as not getting with the program or being a loser who didn't understand the company's genius. Enron was selling an image of limitless growth, innovation, and risk-taking, and challenging that narrative was practically career suicide. As a result, the few employees who did try to sound the alarm, like former Vice President Sharon Watkins, were ignored, sidelined, or worse, actively discouraged from raising concerns. It wasn't just that people were silent, it was that the entire corporate culture actively discouraged dissent and rewarded blind enthusiasm. The echo chamber extended far beyond Enron's walls. Wall Street analysts were so enchanted by the company's numbers that they overlooked glaring inconsistencies in the financial reports. Investment banks like Merrill Lynch and Citigroup were happy to help create and support the dubious financial structures Enron used to mask its losses. Rating agencies like Moody's and Standard & Poor's gave Enron stock and bonds high ratings, turning a blind eye to the fact that the company was, in reality, bleeding cash. Nobody wanted to be the first to say, hold on, something doesn't add up here. As long as Enron was delivering record profits and stock prices kept climbing, the party continued. This culture of groupthink and unchecked enthusiasm led Enron straight off a cliff. When the reality of Enron's house of cards finally came to light, it imploded spectacularly. The company filed for bankruptcy in December 2001, wiping out $74 billion in shareholder value, evaporating thousands of jobs, and decimating employee retirement funds. Many employees had invested their entire 401ks in Enron stock, believing the company line that it was foolproof and unstoppable. They lost everything. The fallout didn't stop there. Enron's collapse also exposed the complicity of their auditors, Arthur Andersen, one of the big five accounting firms at the time, who were found guilty of obstruction of justice for shredding incriminating documents. The firm fell apart in the wake of the scandal. It was a corporate catastrophe that sent shockwaves through the business world and led to sweeping reforms like the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, designed to enforce transparency and accountability in corporate America. In the end, Enron's rise and fall weren't just about financial fraud, they were about a toxic culture where groupthink ruled, where dissent was silenced, and where everyone kept pretending the emperor had clothes because nobody wanted to be the one to point out the obvious. The executives got greedy, the employees stayed quiet, and the watchdogs failed to bark. The result? One of the biggest corporate scandals in history and a cautionary tale of what happens when everyone in the room nods along without question. So, how do you escape groupthink before it turns into a full-blown disaster? First, encourage dissent. If you're the leader, make it clear that disagreeing isn't insubordination, it's smart planning. Try playing devil's advocate. Assign someone the job of poking holes in the plan, on purpose. It's not about being a Debbie Downer, it's about making sure you're not drinking your own Kool-Aid. And if you want honesty, let people share their opinions anonymously. It's easier to speak up when you're not worried about getting dirty looks from the rest of the room. Groupthink can make bad ideas look like good ones, silence valuable objections, and turn reasonable people into yes men. But it's not a death sentence for good decision-making. The key is to encourage debate and welcome diverse perspectives. In the end, real progress comes from asking tough questions, challenging the status quo, and embracing the awkwardness of disagreement. So, the next time you find yourself in a room full of nodding heads, don't be afraid to raise your hand and say, "Is this really a good idea?" Because when everyone agrees, bad things happen. In a world full of groupthink traps, silence isn't golden, it's dangerous. Speak up, question everything, and remember, the best ideas are the ones that survive a good debate.